Have you ever felt like you don't fully belong here? Like you don't always understand your fellow humans, or you're just feeling deeply disconnected from the way that the world operates? Just the sheer amount of conflict, greed, cruelty, all these heavy emotions that we're all living with. It just feels overwhelming. Well, according to Dolores Cannon's work, that feeling might not be accidental. If you watched my first video in this series, then you already know that Dolores Cannon, she was a hypnotherapist who developed her own method that was designed to put the person in a very deep trance and be able to access their subconscious. Over decades of sessions, Dolores began noticing certain patterns in what people described while in these deep trance states. And one of the biggest recurring themes was this idea that certain souls specifically volunteered to incarnate on Earth during this current period of human history. Not to save humanity exactly, but to help stabilize consciousness during a time of major transition, to help people to awaken and remember who they really are beneath all the fear and survival mode, to remind humanity that we're all deeply connected, not separate from one another, not separate from the earth, and not separate from the source itself. And according to the book, one of the biggest ways these volunteers help is simply by remaining calm and grounded while the world around them feels chaotic. Almost like helping others remember light in the middle of confusion. But just to reiterate, I'm approaching this series openly and thoughtfully. I'm not telling you this is absolute fact, but I am exploring what the book says, why it resonates with so many, and why are so many drawn to even this video. What deeper philosophical or spiritual themes might exist underneath? Because whether someone interprets this literally or more symbolically, I still think there's something very human about this material. Of course, in order to get into the three waves of volunteers, we need to understand what the heck they'd be volunteering for in the first place. And to do that, we really need to look at the origins of planet Earth, at least according to Dolores Cannon's book. So originally, according to Dolores Cannon, Earth was part of a kind of experiment. Dolores describes different higher beings or ET groups being involved in helping begin life on this planet very, very early on. And the idea was to create an ideal human experience here. But at some point, a meteorite introduced bacteria and contamination into a fragile developing ecosystem. And according to a culmination of Dolores' hypnosis sessions, there was great sadness that the experiment was contaminated and that humanity would no longer develop perfectly. They even debated about whether the experiment should continue at all, but ultimately they decided the show must go on. Even symbolically, this is really interesting. It tells me that we shouldn't give up just when things don't go according to plan. Humans aren't perfect. I've even said for my first video on this channel that this channel is for imperfect people because we're all beautiful, creative, loving, but we're also chaotic, self-destructive, and deeply emotional creatures. So the experiment continued, but something changed around the time of World War II. Humanity developed some very destructive nuclear weapons. Dolores' hypnosis sessions describe higher beings observing Earth at this time and realizing that humanity had developed technology much faster than consciousness. And look at where we are today. We have incredible technology, instant communication, artificial intelligence, and massive scientific advancement. Yet emotionally, humanity still struggles with war, greed, fear, corruption, violence, division, and power. The book suggests that these beings understood that they could not interfere with us directly because of our free will. So instead, some souls supposedly chose to incarnate as humans themselves. And that's where the concept of the three waves of volunteers comes in. Not conquering or controlling humanity, but influencing things quietly from within through compassion, healing, calmness, creativity, emotional awareness, and love. And whether you are someone that believes this literally or not, I think it's a fascinating framework because real change essentially does happen from person to person first, internally first, not through domination, not through force, and certainly not through fear. So let's talk about the actual 3 waves. And as I explain these, I want you to make note of what resonates, because this is the part where many people who have that sense of not belonging finally start to feel seen. The first wave are generally described as souls born from around the 1950s to around the 1970s. If you want to think about what the United States called this generation, the baby boomers, I think they knew what was at stake here and they really wanted to stack the deck. They wanted to make sure that this plan worked. So they sent in far more volunteers than they thought they would need. Because this plan had been tried before, but they didn't have enough volunteers from within to influence. So according to Dolores, these souls in the first wave had the hardest time adjusting to Earth. She repeatedly describes them as highly sensitive, emotionally overwhelmed, homesick, deeply compassionate, and often confused by human behavior. So many in the first wave, they struggle with things like depression, anxiety, isolation, addiction, suicidal feelings, or just simply feeling like they don't belong here. And one thing that Dolores mentions over and over is that many of these people had difficulty understanding cruelty, violence, manipulation, greed, and why do these emotions feel so dang heavy? It seems like the entire earth feels just emotionally dense to them, like too much. And I think a lot of people relate to this feeling, especially highly sensitive people, people who absorb energy easily, who feel drained by conflict, people who feel emotionally exhausted by modern life. Some of Dolores' hypnosis subjects even described feeling homesick for a place they couldn't remember, which again, you can interpret spiritually or psychologically, but either way, that feeling of longing is real for a lot of us. Then comes in the second wave, and this is actually the group that I personally resonate with the most. The second wave generally refers to people that were born from approximately the 1970s through the 1990s. Yes, I am an 80s baby. These volunteers supposedly came in with a different role. Less dramatic, less emotionally overwhelmed than the first wave, but more focused on stabilizing energy. The book describes them almost like energetic transmitters, beacons, stabilizers, quiet influencers, people whose presence affects others even if they aren't consciously trying to. You may have noticed that this theme comes up constantly throughout the book. Just the idea that consciousness itself affects other people, that emotions spread, whether that be something calming or something that would cause fear. Healing also spreads. And I actually think this part feels very grounded because we already experience this psychologically. You can walk into a room and instantly feel if there's tension. You can also feel safe around certain people. Some people regulate your nervous system just by being present. And the book suggests that many second wave volunteers help humanity simply by being calm, listening, healing, teaching, creating, comforting, or helping others emotionally process life, not necessarily by becoming famous leaders, but quietly affecting the emotional and the energetic environment around them. That's real. Then we have the third wave. These are described as newer generations of children, and according to the book, they arrived already more aligned with these newer energies. Less karmic baggage, more intuitive, and already more emotionally aware. The book describes many of these children as being naturally empathic, psychic, spiritually open, emotionally intelligent, creative, and they are more resistant to old systems. Now, obviously, every generation says that younger generations are different, but it is interesting how many people talk about children being highly intuitive, emotionally perceptive, and more aware than previous generations emotionally. One thing I also started noticing throughout the book is that certain roles or archetypes kept repeating throughout many of these hypnosis sessions. Different people described similar purposes even if they used slightly different wording. Some people were described as observers, watchers, healers, teachers, transmitters, stabilizers, explorers, bridges, broadcasters, grid workers, or simply beacons. And that's what's interesting, is that not all of these roles were about doing something externally. A lot of them were surprisingly subtle. Some people were described as observers, like souls who came here to simply experience humanity and to understand human consciousness firsthand. Others were healers or stabilizers, people whose presence naturally calms others emotionally. Some were described as broadcasters or beacons, meaning their energy supposedly affects the environment around them, almost like transmitting a frequency. Others still, they were categorized as explorers, souls curious about the human experience itself, emotions, physical life, relationships, creativity, struggle, growth, and free will. And then there were the bridge type people, those helping others emotionally process the changes happening in the world and helping people to move forward from fear towards something like greater awareness. I think this is the part of why the book resonates with so many people, because most people don't see themselves as special in some grand dramatic way, but many people do feel deeply sensitive, emotionally aware, drawn towards service and helping others. We're interested in healing, or like we're searching for some deeper meaning and purpose in life. And this book gives language to those feelings. If this material interests you at all, I really do recommend reading the book itself, because one thing that I can't fully capture in a video is the actual hypnosis sessions that Dolores includes throughout the book. A lot of the detail, emotion, symbolism, and strange consistency between sessions is something that you really have to read for yourself and interpret in your own way. Whether you end up reading the book and seeing it more psychologically, spiritually, symbolically, or literally, it's definitely going to give you a lot to think about. Also, there's actually another group that Dolores talks about later in the book that I found incredibly fascinating and worth mentioning, and these are called the Keepers of the Grid. This comes in much later in the book during a hypnosis session with a woman deeply drawn to crystals and energy work. And according to the material, these souls supposedly came here to help restore the Earth's energetic grids. This book connects this to crystals, sacred sites, frequencies, Atlantis, Earth energies, and basically restoring balance to the planet. Now, whether you take that at face value or more as like a symbol, I think the deeper message here is important, because at its core, it's really talking about humanity reconnecting to nature with balance and with the earth itself. And I see a lot in my day-to-day life. Many people feel intuitively drawn towards nature, mountains, oceans, forests, crystals, grounding, or certain locations that just feel different. This book frames some of these people as like energetic anchors, people actually helping stabilize the earth itself emotionally and energetically. One thing I noticed throughout all of these volunteer descriptions is that the common thread is not perfection. Actually, many of the people Dolores describes, they struggled deeply with things like loneliness, depression, exhaustion, trauma, feeling misunderstood, and just questioning their life purpose. And that's one of the main reasons why I do think this material resonates so much emotionally, because underneath all of that cosmic language, the book is really talking about being human during difficult times. It's talking about sensitivity, healing, emotional overwhelm, nervous system exhaustion, purpose, and trying to remain loving in a world that often feels chaotic and hell-bent on destruction. That's relatable. Something else that stood out to me personally is the idea that some people came here not necessarily to do something huge, but simply to hold a certain energy, just to remain calm during chaos, to help others emotionally, to create peace, to stabilize. That does resonate in particular, especially because I've been doing so much work on regulating my own nervous system and healing emotionally. The older I get, the more I realize how much my energy affects other people. And I don't necessarily mean that in some magical way. I mean emotionally. Calm people affect people, grounded people affect others, and fearful people affect those around them too. So, what do I personally think? I think this book gives people a language for feelings that they may have struggled to explain that their entire lives, especially feeling different, feeling emotionally sensitive, feeling disconnected from society, or feeling like you serve a higher purpose or mission beyond just your day-to-day life. Now, whether these waves are literal soul groups or symbolic archetypes for different kinds of sensitive people, I think it's okay to have your own interpretation. But whatever you personally believe, I think that the core message keeps coming back to the same thing. Love matters, and we're all connected. And maybe the real point isn't whether you are literally a volunteer, but what kind of energy do you choose to bring into this world? In the next video, we're going deeper into one of the most controversial parts of the book, the connection between extraterrestrials, consciousness, higher dimensions, light beings, and the idea that many volunteers may not originally be from Earth at all. And that's where this series gets far out, literally. So if you're following along with this deep dive series, definitely subscribe, turn your notifications on, and I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments.